Well, welcome everybody to the Delta Protection Commission for September 20th, 2018. We're going to call the roll, and then we're going to call to order, and then salute to our flag. So the flag is over here. Susan, why don't you lead us, please?
Okay. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Ashley, if you'll call the roll, please.
Yes. Let me have a glance here. Some people walked in on me. I already. Okay. Chair Thompson.
I'm here.
Vice Chair Villegas.
Here.
Commissioner Burgess.
Here.
Commissioner Cott.
Here.
Commissioner Loftus.
Here.
Commissioner Biaggi.
Here.
Commissioner Ferguson.
Here.
Commissioner Slater.
Here.
Commissioner Flournoy.
Here.
Commissioner Moffett.
Here.
Commissioner Roberts.
Here.
I think that's it. A quorum is established.
Okay, thank you, and I apologize if I just point to you tonight. I don't know you all that well, so apologies in advance. So let's move on to item 3, public comment. Anyone in the public wishing to address the commission on items not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 4, consent. Is there a motion to approve the minutes for July 19th? We have a motion by Villegas.
Second.
Second by Burgess and Loftus. I'm going to abstain since I missed last meeting.
I'll abstain too then.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? 2 abstentions, Burgess and Thompson. Okay, moving on to item 5, our regular. Receive a report from our director, Erik Vink.
Great. Whoa, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair and commissioners, and thanks for agreeing to the snug accommodations. This is a beautiful chambers, but it normally only accommodates 7 public officials, and we've managed to fit 13 of you up there, so, or at least 12. My math is off.
Erik, before you make your presentation, I neglected to announce, first I want to thank Susan for this beautiful meeting room, so thank you very much. And as your chair, you all know that I sit on the Delta Stewardship Council. As a result of that position, I'm under an ex parte prohibition, which means that I will be leaving the chambers when we arrive to item 12, dealing with California WaterFix. So those in the public, I would ask that you not make any comments tonight about the California WaterFix while I'm in the room, because then I have to report you, and you don't want to be reported to the state. So having said that, on item 12, I will leave the dais, leave the room, and Oscar Villegas will finish the meeting up for us. Okay, with that said, Erik, sorry.
Yeah, and actually, before I start, Mr. Chair, I do want to acknowledge Senator Kathleen Galgiani. She's our ex officio member from the California State Senate, and she's the state senator representing where we sit tonight, Stockton and much of San Joaquin County. So we really appreciate your being here. And the other acknowledgement, wow, that's still very loud. Before I begin is Commissioner Bush would normally be attending, but today is the State Lands Commission is celebrating their 80th anniversary. And so we do not have a representative from the State Lands Commission, but we wish them well on their 80th anniversary.
And we have a new council sitting next to you. I might want to
Yeah,
introduce her
thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you. Let me introduce Nicole Rinke. Nicole is sitting in tonight for Jessica Tucker Mole. Jessica's doing fine. She's just dealing with some matters that will require her to be away both this evening and our meeting in November. And Nicole has graciously agreed to step in during both of those meetings. And some of you know Nicole because she's counsel for the Delta Conservancy. So she's well steeped in Delta matters, and we're pleased she's here tonight.
Thank you.
So a real quick report, Mr. Chair. First off, I wanted to say just a few things about the Land Use and Resource Management Plan update. And we're pretty much at the point where we're ready to start sharing this with different groups. And our plan is to first take out the meat of the document, which are the goals, objectives, and policies, to the Delta Protection Advisory Committee when they meet in late October. And we're working with the DPAC members to finalize that meeting date as we speak. I don't have it quite yet, but it likely will be the last week of October. And then the intention would be to convene the subcommittee, and want to again thank and hope there's still willingness from Commissioners Wynn, Loftus, Ferguson, and Lester Moffitt to do a little extra work on this land use plan update. And what we would like to do is to convene a meeting of that subcommittee as soon as we know the date for the advisory committee, but it will likely be in the last days of October, perhaps the first couple of days of November. And that would kick off a formal comment period for the draft, and we would intend to share the draft with the subcommittee members. And for that matter, anyone is welcome to attend the subcommittee. We post the meetings publicly, so we can have more than 4 commissioners there. And then over the course of a couple of months, we will work with the advisory committee, the Delta Protection Advisory Committee, to convene opportunities for the public to provide comment into the land use plan. And this will all culminate with perhaps another meeting of the subcommittee, or if it's going quite well, we might just bring it straight to the commission. But we hope to do that early in the new year. But I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the process we'll undertake for that, and to especially thank the three of the 4 subcommittee members who are here tonight, and I'll be communicating with Commissioner Wynn as well. Unless there are any questions about that process or concerns about the process we intend to undertake, I'd like to move on to the second page and highlight the Delta Waterway cleanup, which occurred this past Saturday, and the Commission was in charge of 5 sites throughout the Delta. We were in each of the Delta counties. And a special acknowledgement to Vice Chair Villegas, who not only is a wonderful Vice Chair, but really knows how to clean up trash as well along the river. He was out with Commission members Cabaldon and the Mayor of West Sacramento, Christopher Cabaldon, and Chris Ledesma, who's our alternate Commission member. And all 3 of them were great helpers during the day, and they got other people to come and participate. And that was just one of 5 sites. We had hundreds of people in Antioch, and we had people in Buckley Cove here in Stockton, and out at the buffer lands near the regional sand facility in Sacramento County, and then a waterside cleanup out of Sandy Beach Park in Rio Vista. And special thanks to the Port of West Sacramento and Regional Sand. They were local sponsors that enabled us to get some nice t-shirts and even a few snacks for our volunteers. So a real successful day. Item 5, I just wanted to draw your attention to, because members of the Commission have expressed an interest in the past in being kept informed about significant items related to Delta levees. And I did want to note that the Central Valley Flood Protection Board passed a resolution at their meeting late last month having to do with operation and maintenance deficiencies on levees that are currently inactive in the federal program. And as you might know, about 1/3 of the levee miles in the Delta are part of what we call the State Plan of Flood Control, or some would call federal levees. And almost every one of those levee miles is currently inactive in the program, most for some of those miles because there truly are deficiencies, some of those miles because it's just really difficult if you're a levee official to comply with the federal requirements. They're quite onerous, and our reclamation district representatives around the table could probably speak to this better than I. If you're interested in that action, and it was ultimately something that was worked out with the California Central Valley Flood Control Association, you can take a look at the tape from the board's meeting of August 24th, and there's a link in the staff report. Moving on to Proposition 3, this is the Water Supply and Water Quality Act of 2018, which will be on the November ballot. It's a citizens initiative. It was qualified for the ballot through signature gathering. It's nearly an $8.9 billion bond measure, largely to fund water projects. It includes funding for the Delta Conservancy that Campbell Ingram will talk about a little bit later. It includes funding for the Delta Science Program, but it also includes money for the Commission to support Delta wastewater treatment projects. And this was something back when Supervisor Mary Pifo was chair of the Commission that was worked out with the proponents of the bond, and it made its way through. So this will be on the ballot in November. If it's successful, we'll be administering a program that can help make some water quality improvements in the Delta. And if you're curious, at the bottom of page 2 of my report is the specific language from Prop 3 that describes what that program is. And we'll certainly be talking with the commissioners if Prop 3 is successful on in early November. Finally, I just wanted to mention that we're calling for nominations for the next group of the Delta Leadership Program. And in front of all of the commission members, that little pack of paper near the top of the pile is an application form. And we would encourage you to seek out applicants to nominate or to encourage people to self-nominate. We do accept self-nominations. This year we'll start the program a little bit earlier in late November, and over the course of 5 months we'll take our participants through day-long seminars where we cover important topics relative to the Delta and also help develop some of their personal skills that can help them to be more effective in their community or with their organization that they represent, whatever their connection is to the Delta. This will be our 4th year of the program. We're real excited about it. We do get support from entities and are co-sponsoring it with the Delta Regional Foundation. They're our partner in the effort. I won't say much about the Commission's land use comment letters, but if anyone has questions about any of those, I'd be happy to entertain them. And then finally, I always include in my upcoming events in the Delta, and the fall is a particularly active time in the Delta. There's just a number of great events coming up in the next few months, and we always encourage people to check those out. And then the last page of the report is a current snapshot of where we are as we head into concluding the first quarter of our fiscal year 18-19 budget. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about that, Mr. Chair.
Any questions for Erik? See none, we'll move on. Item 6, I guess that's the DPAC, and Barbara and I rode up in the elevator, so you're going to make that presentation?
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Barbara Daly. I live in Clarksburg, and I'm on the Delta Protection Commission Advisory Committee. I represent businesses in the Delta, and I was also on the prior advisory committee representing the people of the Delta. And I'm here tonight to talk with you about Agenda Item 6 and the recommendation that the advisory committee is making to you. Chair Mark Pruner couldn't be here tonight, so he is chairman of the advisory committee. I'm vice chair, so he's kept me informed along the whole way during all the meetings that we've been talking about this during our meetings. there are 4 things we thought we would like you to know. And that is that the advisory committee has spent several months working on this to get it in good shape and present it to you tonight. Everyone in the meetings contributed to this. It passed to come forward to you with no opposition from any of the advisory committee members. And this is a very critical time in the process because the Delta Stewardship Council has opened up various parts of the Delta Plan for updating. So this would be a good time to get this forward to them. And we on the advisory committee recommend it's time to speak because the statute is clear. The reliable water supply for all of California and the restoration of the Delta environment statute says it shall be achieved in a manner that protects and enhances the unique Delta values, agricultural, recreational, the cultural, and the natural resources as an evolving place. But currently, in the Delta Plan, if you don't know, it is separated from the rest of the plan on Chapter 5. Something wrong? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Oh, hello, Mr. Supervisor Natoli. This brings the Delta as an evolving place and its unique values front and center to all aspects of the Delta Plan, all its chapters, all its policies, its matrices, et cetera. And I do think, to sum up, page 2, the second paragraph really says it best. By separating out Delta as place discussions and decisions in the Delta Plan, the Delta Stewardship Council minimizes the effort to protect the unique Delta values. We are requesting that you recommend to the Delta Stewardship Council that it be included in all chapters and all policies and all matrices. And that concludes my representation for the advisory committee, and I'd like to help answer, along with Erik, any questions you might have.
Any questions for Barbara? In the report, there is a highlighted recommendation for the council, for the commission to consider. It's on page 2 of that agenda item. So what's the pleasure of the commission? Can I get a motion?
So moved.
I have a motion, Burgess, second by Cott. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you, unanimous. Oh,
Thank
public comment, I'm sorry. I'm just anxious tonight, I guess. Is there anyone in
Big
the
agenda.
audience that would like to comment on the item that Barbara just presented? Okay, well, thank you. The item passes. Okay,
Excellent. Thank you so much.
okay, moving on to item 7, receive a presentation on Frank's Tract Futures Feasibility Study. Carl Wilcox. Welcome, Carl. How are we doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, Chair. Chair Thompson, Commission members, it's my pleasure to be here. I want to talk to you about the Frank's Tract Restoration Feasibility Study that was completed by the department in June of this year. The feasibility study was an element of the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy that was put forward by the Resources Agency in 2016. The department received funding in its budget to undertake the study, and over 18 months completed that. We involved the Department of Water Resources to do the hydraulic modeling work associated with the feasibility study, and then through the Metropolitan Water District contracted with Moffitt and Nickel Engineer to do the engineering feasibility. Also, as part of the study, UC Davis was involved, Brett Milligan and his graduate student, to look at the human dimension components of working out there and engaging with the local community. The focus of the restoration or planning in relationship to Delta Smelt, and I think we learned things about changing fish communities as we went forward, and that there are multi-benefits potentially associated with this for the environment, there are also a lot of consequences, particularly in relation to Delta as place, and we understand that, and I think we tried to reflect it in the report itself as an important component of any future planning. But the objectives are improve habitat conditions for Delta smelt and declining native and pelagic fishes. We expanded on the Delta smelt to include the others, and pelagic fishes include a number of species like striped bass, threadfin shad, which have been part of the pod or the pelagic organism decline that occurred in the early 2000s, where we saw declines in native fishes as well as these pelagic fishes that are important components of the ecosystem. Also improve food web support, particularly to the pelagic environment by export from tidal marsh systems. Originally, there was an intent to look at turbidity enhancement, but that's kind of difficult, and we kind of dropped that out. There is turbidity associated with the marsh and detrital input, but it's not generating a cloud of turbid water all the time. Originally, we were trying to maybe look at moving or recreating a grizzly bay in Frank's Tract to accommodate sea level rise and climate change and that kind of thing in the future, and the movement of X2 upstream associated with that. Also reducing predation and reducing submerged aquatic vegetation. And so those kind of go together in that submerged aquatic vegetation supports a lot of introduced non-native predatory fish. And then reduce entrainment of Delta smelt and other fish into the central Delta and ultimately potentially onto the pumps. Frank's Tract plays a central role in the Delta, particularly hydrodynamically. It's basically a short-circuiting of the historic kind of flow patterns in the Delta, and is a vehicle for introducing salty water or saline water, particularly in drier times of the year or during drought periods, into the central Delta and making water management difficult. So, there are some benefits that could be achieved by modifying Frank's Tract from a habitat perspective as well from a water quality perspective. Frank's Tract currently, it's a shallowly flooded island. It's different from many of the adjacent islands like Webb Tract or Bradford, which are very deeply subsided, 20 feet or more in many cases. Frank's Tract, because it failed in 1938 and was only reclaimed for about 30 years, is maybe 6 to 8 feet below sea level. So it's relatively shallow, and it's very conducive to submerged aquatic vegetation, and that provides great habitat for centrarchid fishes, particularly largemouth bass. The initial approach, as I mentioned, looked at kind of trying to recreate Grizzly Bay in Frank's Tract, and after talking with a number of scientists and hydrologists in the system, we kind of shifted gears and looked more at trying to focus on tidal marsh habitat creation, because this kind of left us with what we had with a big beach at the back. And so we shifted to looking at and being guided by the Delta Renewed, which is part of the Delta Landscape Projects that was conducted by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And the Delta Renewed, kind of builds upon the historical ecology of the Delta and then how it's been changed, and then make some recommendations for things you could do to recapture some of the historical processes and functions. Not that you're going to restore the Delta to what it was, but there are some things that can be done as part of restoration activities and ecosystem enhancements that can recover some of those things. And so we used Delta Renewed as kind of a guide in how we design things. And part of that is going back and kind of looking at the historical condition. Frank's Tract historically was part of a very large marsh system that included Bradford, Webb Tract, Frank's Tract, Bethel Island, Hotchkiss Tract, Little Holland Tract. And if this thing has a pointer, yes. And as part of that, you can see that all of these slough channels didn't go through. They were all embedded in the large marsh plain. And the tidal circulation went around through the Sacramento River, or the San Joaquin River, and into Old River. And so subsequently, you know, with reclamation, these were straightened, connected, and from the previous slide, you can see how the hydrology changed. So, you know, False River is called False River because when it was originally named, it looked kind of like the San Joaquin River, but it didn't go anywhere. So part of it was looking at reducing this interconnectedness, which has its challenges, particularly as it relates to navigation, and focusing on creating blind channel systems and dead-end sloughs and that kind of thing to increase residence time. Oops. The biological objectives, enhance habitat conditions. I've kind of been through these. Minimize habitat for non-native fish and invasive species. Create elevations to establish large area of emergent marsh. Modify tidal circulation. Eliminate tidal flow directly through Frank's Tract. Increase the channel marsh ratio or edge ratio, and then limit salinity movement into the through Frank's Tract to Old River and increase residence time within the system to improve productivity. The initial concept that we evaluated looked at restoring about 1,000 acres, both in western Frank's Tract and in Little Frank's Tract. But primarily focused on this, and then it included elements that restricted tidal flow through the system. That was modeled and worked pretty well, and this was generated purely from a biological perspective, to look at that and to have something to evaluate for engineering assessment and for hydraulic assessment. So as we moved through this process, working with UC Davis, we started outreach with the local community, the fishing community, hunting community, to get feedback, and we got lots of feedback. And I think, you know, we've tried to reflect that in the report. There's a whole section on that. We also worked with State Parks, who's the owner of Frank's Tract. It's a state recreation area. To look at consistency with the existing general plan and what changes, if restoration were to occur out there, would need to be made. And so that's reflected within the report itself. Most of those sections were written primarily by State Parks or with their strong input. The public outreach report, along with the hydrologic modeling report and the engineering feasibility study and subsequent reports, are available on the department's website. The community outreach, you know, included questionnaires, meetings, discussions with State Parks and others, as I indicated, you know, and we really came away with this as if there's subsequent planning around this issue, it really needs to be started from the beginning with the local community and working with them and the other affected stakeholders. Community considerations include boating, fishing, waterfowl hunting, the state recreational use in the area itself, and boating and really navigation associated with it. Infrastructure concerns, particularly for the Bethel Island community as it relates to flooding potential and those kinds of things. And then the economic considerations of what changes would and how they would affect the local economy out there. As part of that process, you know, a local alternative or proposed design was put forward. You know, we were able to evaluate that at least cursorily from an engineering perspective, and hydrodynamically, that version doesn't work quite as well, but you know, if you were to do additional work out there, you could probably refine it so it worked pretty well. It was focused on addressing many of the concerns of the local community at the time, particularly the navigation issues, the fishing and hunting issues, and the effects particularly of people being able to get out of Piper Slough and off of the north shore of Bethel Island as fast as they can. So they use the breaches in the existing levee into Frank's Tract to get to wherever they're going as fast as they can, because if they're stuck in Piper Slough, there's a 5-mile-an-hour speed limit. And particularly for the bass tournaments, those people want to get to wherever they're going in the Delta in their bass boat as fast as they can. And then there's also the issue of, particularly for the Discovery Bay community, but also people coming up from San Francisco, using False River as a shortcut to get farther into the Delta, either to Discovery Bay or out of Discovery Bay or down towards Stockton. So with that, you know, from an engineering perspective, it's doable. It's expensive. You know, you can achieve the habitat characteristics that we were trying to get at. We can potentially reduce entrainment. We also, as part of the engineering analysis, looked at just using on-site material. So deepening the eastern portion and using that material to raise the elevation in whatever restored area was done, and that looks doable. It substantially reduces the cost from importing material from some other source. Water quality benefits can be achieved. You know, and when we talk about water quality benefits, these are fairly small changes in salinity, but they're at kind of critical times, as I mentioned, during the summer and or during drought periods. You know, doing something out there can work as kind of a permanent drought barrier. So something to anticipate in the future. It's generally consistent with the management plan for the rec area. And, you know, as I've mentioned, going forward, strong engagement with the local community and stakeholders and others in any future planning. And with that, I'm done. We would also look at coordinating any additional efforts with the Central Delta Corridor Partnership that you're going to hear about from Campbell, and then also the East Contra Costa Shoreline Adapting to Rising Tides effort that's currently underway. And I think we have a lot of potential synergy there if we engage in that with them. So with that, the report's available online, along with the resiliency strategy and all the supporting documents.
All right, Carl, thank you.
Sure.
I believe Supervisor Burgess has some questions.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it's kind of ironic that we're talking about the historical part of that area when we're not even talking about the historical delta of what it used to be. So we want to do this little area, but the rest of it, we're talking about doing all kinds of different things. I've spent the last 10, 11 years working on habitat restoration and water quality issues, so I'm very supportive of those efforts. But I also support and represent some human people that have recreational, economic, and kind of a cultural interest in all of this. And so I have a lot of constituents that are not happy with this. There's also some confusion from looking at the study. We talk about kind of the flow as it is, but that's changing, and there's even efforts that we're not going to talk about right now that that could have impacts. And there's even hypothetically, if there were some projects done that would take material to be used for that project that would affect that. So to me, this project is kind of, there's a lot of question marks to me. Today, the DPC is not taking an action on the study, correct? Okay. So on the next steps for the feasibility study is to secure funding to prepare for the EIR. Would this project be eligible to receive funds from November's water bond?
It could potentially. I think at this point, we're looking at probably funding something that would develop a plan,
Okay.
an actual plan as opposed to a feasibility study. So work through the process, come up with something, working with the local community, others, the affected agencies and those kinds of things, to come up with a plan that you could actually take someplace and say, this has support amongst these constituents, and then move it to the next step. So I think that's where we are at this point, and that plan then could be the jumping off point if there was interest in taking it farther, in doing an environmental assessment and those kinds of things to move it towards some kind of reality.
And you talked about the local proposal and kind of the maybes, but how seriously are they looking at that?
Well, I think the whole next step would be to sit down and look at alternatives, and one of the things that we would look at is using, continuing to contract with DWR's modelers to model, do scenarios in effect, and look at how you could lay things out, how you could tweak them to achieve multiple benefits, particularly on the water quality side and the habitat side, as well, while addressing the issues of navigation in particular.
I'd hope that there would be plans to conduct economic analysis that would look at the impacts to recreation, bass fishing, the restaurants, the marina facilities that use Frank's Tract on a daily basis. Are you actively seeking funding to prepare for the EIR?
We have identified potential funding to work on a plan.
So yes.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the feasibility study, let's see, got all my notes here. We've been preparing for this. The feasibility study incorporates a local proposal that moves restoration to the north, minimizing impacts to boating and fishing. Thank you. But has CDFW done an engineering feasibility assessment and or a hydrodynamic modeling on this local proposal?
We assessed both of them, and there isn't a supplemental report on the hydro modeling, but there is a supplemental engineering report that was done to look at specifically the local proposal.
Okay, I'd like to probably make some comments later, but
Okay,
that was...
thank you. Don?
Just a quick question. Carl, thanks for your presentation. On the findings slide, I just want to make sure I understand what this, again, it's one of your bullets. It says, an example of reconciliation requiring a recognition that Frank's Tract / Delta is a novel ecosystem. Can you, in lay terms, what
Sure.
does that
So
mean?
that, this is something that particularly has come from Peter Moyle and the folks at UC Davis about, the Delta is something that's not what it used to be, and it's not going to be what it used to be, but you can put some of those components in, and it has components there that are important, particularly in the context of Delta as place, and we need to recognize that. And so that's the reconciliation part of it, is being able to work with what's there. And
Okay, and it goes to Diane's earlier point about, an altered system that has, certainly evolved over time, but got 150 years plus or minus of changes out there, and I think that all needs to be the backdrop, obviously, for looking at certainly the species recovery and or addressing some of the other issues that have been created via things that have either been allowed to happen or we actively engage in with water transfer and so forth. So, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I hear about restoring the delta. What's the proper definition of that? And what year is that? Are you want to go back to 200 years ago, or do you want to go back to 100 years ago, or where do you want to go? As a landowner, I'm afraid you want to bring the Delta back to where it was? I mean, when, in 1740, 1850? Where?
Well, I think that the effort, you know, and restoration of the Delta is in the eye of the beholder, like much of the Delta Reform Act is. You know, what is the water supply reliability and the reduction in reliance on the Delta? That depends on your perspective. So, you know, I think the effort to date for restoration is focused on, through eco-restore, places around the edges where it's relatively easy to do things and achieve some of the historical components. Like I mentioned, I think is pretty widely recognized, you're not going to take the Delta back to what it was pre-1850. So you look for opportunities, particularly using the Delta Renewed on public lands, which, you know, has been a major focus on, you know, restoration should happen in public lands. So, you know, this is an example of trying to apply it. And this is a kind of a different approach. You know, most of the restoration is focused on the North Delta or Sassoon, which basically, you know, then we're going to give up on the rest of. And I think we have a chance with Frank's Tract to do something meaningful that can have a lot of benefits for the local community, maintain the existing uses, and maybe enhance them in ways. But that's a conversation that needs to go on, and I think is reflected in what we've tried to present in the Delta Conservation Framework of how you develop a conservation action that addresses the broader array of concerns and achieves multiple benefits. So that's, I think, what we would try to apply as we go forward, and I think you'll hear more from Campbell about what's being done with the Central Delta Corridor Partnership, which is the same kind of thing, or what's being done in the Yolo Bypass with Yolo Bypass Cash Slough Partnership, trying to look at all of the interests and bring them together to balance them out and address these broader issues relative to economics and place of use and recreation and community aesthetics for.
You say everything but ag.
And ag.
You
well,
say everything but ag. You never
well,
say ag anywhere.
No,
the constituency is fish and recreation and
right.
water skiers and whatever.
So ag.
You have not said ag today.
Well, you know, Frank's Tract isn't currently agricultural lands. I think that's going to be a major component of the Central Delta Corridor project. It's certainly a central component of the Yolo Bypass effort. So, you know, I think it's well recognized that agriculture is an important component of how these kinds of activities go forward.
Other questions? Thank you, Carl. Now the time for the public to weigh in. Ms. Lenora Clark. Okay.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Lenora Clark, and I'm a resident of Discovery Bay. I'm the Staff Commodore of the Pacific Interclub Yachting Association and on the Board of Directors for Recreational Boaters of California. And I provided Mr. Vink with a copy of our position paper on information that we've been able to glean from residents of the Delta and recreational boaters that utilize the Delta. I listened to Mr. Wilcox's presentation on why they feel like there is a need for a restoration project in Frank's Tract. Most of the residents and constituents there don't believe that there is any need to restore Frank's Tract. we first found out about the feasibility study and the surveys that were going on in Discovery Bay, and bar none, people were very, very upset and very concerned about how this was going to proceed on. Then we had the opportunity to talk with both residents and businesses in Bethel Island. And there is certainly an economic disadvantage to those constituents, both from property value to the marinas, to the restaurants that not only serve the residents of Bethel Island, but service all of the recreational boaters that are in and out of Bethel Island. There was a mention of Discovery Bay, and that would entail almost an hour of additional transit time and fuel consumption to go around Frank's Tract, as opposed to the way we've been able to use the Delta and Frank's Tract for the more than 30 years that I've lived in Discovery Bay. We are looking at not only the loss of economic advantage, but the mere fact that the Delta is a state-recognized recreational area. There are over 150 bass and other fishing tournaments that go on in this area that would be prohibited if this project goes forward. So I would hope that you would consider our concerns, and we certainly are very, very much interested in being a part of the discussion. Recreational Boaters of California have been around for over 50 years. We have directors, 9 directors from Southern California, 9 appointed from Northern California. So we don't get into a lot of the water wars or movement because we're a statewide board of directors. But our Southern California directors have signed on with us to our concern about not being able to navigate the California Delta, which we consider to be our right. Are there any questions?
Well, thank you. Any questions? Ryan? Any further questions? I think you laid out the concerns, and I think you've emphasized the issues that are important to your community. I mean, certainly the marinas and the economic impact that may be felt by this project, and I'm sure that Carl and his staff are going to be working with you closely to try to figure out how they can best be addressed. And I know that Ms. Burgess will be on top of that.
Yeah, and since there's no DPC action today, I'd like to ask that my colleagues support a motion that the Delta Protection Commission will prepare written comments when an EIR is prepared for Frank's Tract. And I think there'd even be some value in having some public hearings prior to the close of the public comment period on the EIR to help inform the Delta Protection Commission's comments on the draft EIR.
Erik, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, this would be a significant Delta project, and we strive to comment on environmental documents or plans related to any significant project in the Delta. So I certainly hear that message loud and clear, and we would be working very closely with Cal Fish and Wildlife as they further develop this idea.
Okay. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Okay, moving on to item 8. I believe you want to introduce it, Erik?
Yeah, I'd like to introduce to the Commission Campbell Ingram, known to many on the dais. He's the Executive Officer for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy and is here tonight to talk about the Central Delta Corridor strategy and a lot of bond funding that the Conservancy is administering and might be administering much more if Prop 3 is successful in November.
Great, well, thank you. Chair Thompson, Commissioners, good evening. Thank you for having me. Sort of by way of introduction, I certainly see some new faces on the Commission. Just so you are aware, we are a state conservancy. We have a dual role of being a lead for ecosystem restoration as well as providing some role in economic development in the Delta. We have Proposition $1, Proposition $68, and as Erik mentioned, I'll give a little update on those two pots of money, and then we are anticipating that if Prop 3 passes, a pretty significant chunk of funding will come to us in that process as well. So Erik has a nice staff report that sort of summarizes, it doesn't sort of, it very nicely summarizes the Central Delta Corridor process. I think I've given a bit of a presentation to the Commission before when we were at the winery several months ago, but I'll kind of take it a little bit from the beginning. I think the first thing to note is if you look at the map here, what you see is these are the islands within the Delta that are publicly owned and or publicly financed. Conservancy tries to play a role in bringing the community, the constituents together to think about how do we move forward in the Delta, how do we look at doing restoration and or agricultural sustainability investment in a way that we're all working together to identify our priorities to do so. So what we wanted to do is bring those landowners together because we thought that couple things. If you look at the corridor, it's along the McCollum River. It is a significant ecological corridor. And it also really is responsive to what we've heard for a very long time from the Delta community that they would like to see restoration done on publicly owned lands first. So we thought, let's bring these landowners together and let's see if we can't do a planning process to identify how do we get the most ecological benefit out of this corridor that we can while thinking about maintaining agricultural viability in the region, looking at flood protection, looking at water supply, and looking at recreation opportunities as well in that region. So we wanted to come up with a high-level strategy. Interestingly, there's not a lot of difference between a publicly owned island and a privately owned island in the Delta. Your bottom line is still agriculture pays the bills. It pays the funding to do the levee maintenance. It pays the funding for all of your operations. So where we thought some of these publicly owned islands were they have objectives to do habitat restoration, but they're very conscious of their need to maintain agricultural viability as well. So that was a really sort of a pivotal point in our early discussions, that everything we're doing here is trying to recognize that ag is driving the train, and so what we're going to try to do is going to try to be very responsive to those realities. So we pulled the landowners together, subject matter experts. I'll kind of provide a little bit of a list of everyone that's participated, and we worked for a while to try to design a process that would really help us go through a fairly rapid process of looking at each of these islands individually, looking at opportunities, constraints, what is it that we can reasonably do in this corridor, and then put it together in a strategy that would help guide how we spend these public dollars that I'll tell you about in the next section, as well as any other investments that may be made in this corridor. So what we came upon was we wanted to do a design charrette. We had our design charrette on August 8th and 9th, and then we have a couple meetings after that to take the information that we got out of the charrette and sort of craft it into a high-level strategy. So let me just tell you a little bit about the charrette and what we did and who participated. First, we did it up in Walnut Grove. We were very pleased. We had about 70 participants in that charrette, which is pretty substantial for at least our historic efforts to bring the community out. We had some landowners, not as many as we would have liked, but what we did have was the Reclamation District engineers from several of the districts up there, and they were extremely helpful in that process. Erik participated. We also had the landowners themselves. We had just some folks that were just generally interested. We had some of the county representatives, and we had a lot of the NGO communities and some of the consultant communities as well. And what we did is we looked at the islands. We kind of started in the Western Delta, looking at Metropolitan Water District, looking at Department of Water Resources islands in Sherman and Twitchell. And then we looked at the Central Delta, which included Metropolitan Water District's islands, and then up the corridor to include the Nature Conservancy, up into the Cosumnes Preserve, and then all the way up into the Stone Lakes Preserve. So we just kind of went section by section, and again, thought about what are the ecosystem opportunities, what are the constraints, how do we keep agriculture viable, How do we look at the flood protection system, the water supply system, and what recreational opportunities might we want to consider or think about in this process? So from that process, we got a tremendous amount of feedback, lots of good high-level strategies there was pretty good general consensus on. Here are the things that we think we can do. We are taking that information now, working with the landowners, some of the experts, some of the other interested parties, and we're going to put that into a strategy. One of the things I like to say about this process is I'm not sure that there's a whole lot that's new coming out of this process. We've all, I think every one of these landowners and most of the stakeholders have known about certain opportunities, things we could do in the corridor, but it is an opportunity for us to come together, work together, and state it together. So again, what I envision is a fairly high-level strategy that will look at all those components. I think it's important to recognize, I do say I have a map over there, that's pretty handy. It is important to recognize some of the fundamental characteristics here. You know, looks like the pointer is losing steam. Deeply subsided area right here. There was a general consensus that one of the high priorities in this strategy ought to be trying to do whatever we can to stop subsidence. Lots that you can do around that, but you know the strategy will be a little more specific. As you start to move up the McCollum you also sort of shift right about in this area from a fluvial system, so a river system that flood protection is more river-driven, to a tidal system. So right about here is the tidal elevation. So there's really very little opportunity to recreate tidal habitat, wetland habitat that's actually connected to the river systems. The real opportunities are, you know, what are you going to do about subsidence? What are you going to do for edge habitat in here to provide habitat for salmonids as they make that transition or that traverse that corridor? What are the opportunities for riparian habitat? What are the opportunities for avian habitat, both waterfowl and other birds on the islands themselves, wildlife-friendly agriculture? So again, there's not a whole lot that's new in that discussion, but it is all of us together, working together to articulate it in a way that recognizes the opportunities, the constraints, all the concerns, and then hopefully helps us identify how we best invest funding in the future to achieve agricultural viability as well as ecological objectives in that corridor. Next steps are we will have a workshop in November that will share in more detail what sort of came out of that design charrette, and then we will have a draft of the document that will come out, and of course there will be public review. We would present it to the commission and hopefully get your feedback on that, and then ultimately it's a strategy. It's a high-level strategy. We hope that it's a living document that we can update through time, but again, it's out there for information for anyone to use for any purpose, but most specifically really trying to think about how do we invest public dollars most effectively to achieve objectives. I'll leave it at that for any questions, and then I'll go into the proposition discussion.
Questions for?
I have a question. Can you give me the names of the landowners?
Sure. Of the islands themselves?
Well, the ones that were in this.
So certainly, they're listed on the, I think they're listed in this stack, but Sherman and Twitchell are owned by Department of Water Resources.
Yep.
Metropolitan Water District, this pointer is
I know what they own.
Okay.
Give me a regular landowner.
Yeah.
Regular landowners. I don't.
How many regular landowners?
I'm sorry?
I mean, I have no ones from the Central Delta. You have no one from the South Delta.
Well, so there were several landowners at the meeting. I don't recall their names. We had the reclamation district engineers for the reclamation districts that are working on these islands, and we did a lot of outreach. We would have much preferred to have many more landowners, but we had the landowners that are the owners of the islands that we're considering. We had some surrounding landowners, and then we had the reclamation district engineers that are actively managing those levees on those islands as well. So absolutely, we would welcome and would appreciate more local landowners in the discussion.
I think you're misinforming the public when you come to tell me that Department of Water Resources is a landowner in the Delta for the good of the Delta, and I mean, that's just not true. And so there's a certain conception from the public that knows why they bought that island, what are they going to do with those islands, and agriculture is like the last on the list. So when you present yourself as a landowner and you got 5 out of the 6 or 7 spots are owned by the state and manipulated by DWR, that's not a consensus of the Delta. That's prejudice against the Deltas. I mean, I don't understand why Zuckerman Farms of 10,000 acres was never in there. I'm on the Central Delta Water Agency, president of Central Delta Water Agency. I never saw any of that. And Bob Ferguson's on the Southern Delta Water Agency. Do you know about this, Bob? And he's a landowner since 1800. I mean, it's misrepresentation of the people on that committee.
I can share all the outreach that we did. Tom Zuckerman actually participated in the two-day event representing Central Delta Water District. You know, your Department of Water Resources owns those islands, absolutely, and I think that actually presents an opportunity to achieve habitat benefits on those islands that doesn't take ag land out of or doesn't take private land out of production. So I think our objective was to try to get ecological benefit from publicly owned lands in the Delta. I guess I'm not seeing the misrepresentation.
Well, that's fine. If you say publicly owned land, that's fine. But when you say landowners,
well, no,
state public lands, that's different. And Metropolitan Water District is not me, never will be me. And I'm a landowner in Delta forever.
Right.
So we're not being represented. I don't mind that. I mean, if I didn't go to the meeting, that's my own fault. But
just want to make sure, just so there's no misunderstanding. Our purpose was to look at the lands that have been funded with public dollars,
okay,
or are owned by the state,
okay,
and try to think about the corridor and how we might manage those publicly owned lands in a way that can achieve ecological objectives. And again, it was largely to be responsive to what we've heard from the Delta for a long time, which is if you're going to do restoration, do it on publicly owned lands.
right.
So we involved those public landowners, and then we tried to involve as many of the surrounding landowners as we could, just sort of neighbor to neighbor. You know, here's what we're going to be doing on our state-owned lands, and we want to hear from you how that affects you potentially as an adjacent neighbor or in the surrounding region. So that was our intention.
We don't really see state lands in Metropolitan Water District as good neighbors. Quite the contrary.
I can understand that, and I think part of this was to try to bring the neighbors together to really have good discussion about what are the expectations for those islands, and how might those expectations really impact surrounding landowners, just so we're having that dialogue.
Thank you.
Senator Galgiani.
I think what you're hearing here is some of the frustration about just in general what's happening. And I can tell you that I'm going to be watching very closely with how the notifications are made and who's notified and who's not and who's left out. And speaking personally, as a member of the legislature, I learned 24 hours before a joint legislative budget hearing on the state water project contract, and we only learned 24 hours in advance. It
Right.
was a jam at the end of the session. We learned on a Wednesday about a Thursday hearing, when the deadline for session was Friday, and nobody's attention was focused on the matter at hand,
Right.
which the discussion was over contracts that have been in place since the 1960s and will be in place for many, many years to come. As a member of the Delta Caucus, I was not notified. I learned 24 hours ahead of time, and I am a member of the legislature. So if that's the kind of notification that I'm getting because the WaterFix project is being jammed through, I look with suspicion on how others are notified that should be at these meetings. And if Commissioner Biaggi is saying that landowners didn't know about the meeting, I absolutely believe him because I know what happened to myself as a member of the legislature. So
I understand.
say this to caution you that I'm going to be watching. I think everybody here is going to be watching. It's critically important that it not just be a few at the state level who have an ulterior motive in mind of getting WaterFix done, and everyone here is conscientious that sort of clouds over everything that's occurring.
Understood. And we take that to heart too. We are the Conservancy. We have a local members on our board as well. Fundamentally, our role is to incorporate the community into these type of discussions. So we sat with the counties and the locals and said, here is our list of people that we think we need to make aware. We asked them who they think needed to be incorporated or, at least be aware. We posted notices throughout the Delta. We have an 800-person listserv that we sent out to. So, I think we're always open to anything else we can do to make sure that we're getting the message out to the right people. But I think in this case, we did a pretty credible job of putting that information out there. Through our evolution, we've heard a variety of ways that people think are effective. So this time we actually posted flyers throughout the Delta at libraries, stores, churches. We worked with the team of people, the landowners themselves. Who are your neighbors? Who are you reaching out to? Who are you talking to on a daily basis? The county was involved, Sacramento County representatives. We asked them who they thought needed to be notified and involved. And again, we send it out to our listserv, which is about 800 people in the Delta that we interact with regularly. That includes all the counties. We have supervisors on our board as well who we ask to notify their staffs. And again, we are all about trying to incorporate everybody that needs to be in the discussion, and completely open to all ideas about how we can do a better job of making sure everybody knows. We are, on the other hand of that, we are constantly frustrated about still the challenge of bringing people into those discussions, and we understand the reasons for that. It's a target-rich environment for where you spend your time in the Delta, and agriculture is a labor-intensive effort, and there's not a lot of free time, but we work hard at trying to get people into those conversations.
I don't think I was so concerned. I mean, I take the responsibility for not knowing about the meeting. I'm concerned about, did you have a board? Or, I mean, the people you reached out to, they're not representative of the Delta as a whole. That's all I'm saying. You got Metropolitan. Why would you ever pick them?
No, so
and you also have the two state lands. Is that Delta people? That's Sacramento and Los Angeles people.
Well, if I may, maybe, Erik, do we have a list that may be more Delta-centric than Campbell's? Can we assist them in getting a message out?
Yeah, I mean, both of our organizations are perfecting our list that we contact, and we did send out to the people on our list. I think part of the challenge here, Commissioner Biaggi, is that, and I've always been a little uncomfortable with the name of this effort, because it sounds like it involves everyone in this corridor, and really what it is, as Campbell has mentioned, it's really trying to get together those managers of the publicly owned lands. In addition, lands that are owned by the Nature Conservancy, which of course they're a private organization, but they acquired those lands with public money. And it was always with an intention of doing something related to habitat improvements. So again, not just publicly owned land, but also privately owned land that was acquired with a conservation intent in mind and was funded by public monies. And I wish there were a better, snappier way to describe it, because I've run across this a few times. People see the name of this effort and they're like, I'm in the Central Delta and I've not heard about it. Well, of course we want everyone to hear about it, and to be fair to Campbell, we did have some good representation covering the region, at least representative of the type of concerns that they should be hearing about this effort. But I think the title is a bit of a misnomer, because the intention is not to pull in all of the landowners, unless private landowners want to do habitat improvements on their property, in which case they really should be incorporated. But it's really just to be focusing in on those publicly owned lands, or lands acquired with public monies. And I really tip my hat to them. I think they've done a real credible job of trying to balance all of those interests and not just make this about how to do a lot more restoration on the landscape. And I especially took note of Campbell's first comment, which is what I noticed following this process and being a participant, which is that agriculture is pretty deeply embedded. It might not be as intensive an agriculture as you or Commissioner Slater or Commissioner Ferguson are practicing on your farms, but agriculture is pretty firmly embedded throughout all of those lands. And Russ Ryan, who manages the Metropolitan Water District lands, is here in the audience, and I think he could echo that as well. So that made a big impression on me, was a very early focus on agriculture is going to be part of the picture here. And how can these landowners do other things that can provide habitat restoration benefit while recognizing that they need to maintain agriculture as an important part of their operations to basically fund the effort. And I don't want to put words in Russ Ryan's mouth, but I think that's the first thing he would say is they've got to continue farming those lands, otherwise there's no hope they'll just hemorrhage money trying to manage them. So the Conservancy's always been very sensitive. The board of the Conservancy includes county supervisors from each of the 5 Delta counties. They're making sure that Campbell hears the message loud and clear. I don't think he has to hear it anymore. It's just pretty firmly embedded into his core at this point. I'm tracking. We're trying to get others involved, but I really want to echo one thing he said, which is we're asking a lot of people out there, and especially a lot of Delta agriculturalists. We want them to participate in so many different efforts, and the reality is I think we're going to have to rely upon representatives for those folks, whether it's a consultant for Central Delta Water Agency or even yours truly here that is very sensitive to the concerns that you all express, to be able to participate and pull in people when we know, hey, this is getting really close to something that I think people need to know about. But I've been pretty impressed with what this group has come up with so far. I'll withhold my judgment until the final report, but I think it's going to be very respectful of everything that we hold dear as a commission, while at the same time trying to advance a high-level vision of how we can get some more habitat restoration value out of these lands that are in public ownership, and that's really where we should be seeking that higher restoration value first before we start training our eyes on acquiring additional privately owned land. So I hope that's helpful.
The thing that concerns me is that if you could have a target, what's your restoration target? Do this little project and then do that little project? Is that what we're looking at? Or are we looking at globally, this is what we want the Delta to look like in 2050? Is that what's being considered or no?
So
I just want to do this little.
Yeah. So the system right now has, some different targets expressed in different ways. In what we're trying to do, we're looking at this corridor just to see what it is we think we can achieve in the near term to add habitat value, right? And so there's not a big target out there. There's not a specified target about how much habitat we need or necessarily how much we think is sufficient. It's given what we have, what do we think we can achieve in the most scientifically defensible and the way that's most sensitive to all these other concerns. So that's really what we're trying to do. And really the reason why we're trying to do this is because we sort of lack currently in the system, some articulation of how much habitat is enough. And that's a really hard thing to do in an ecological system, is know how much we need. So we're looking at trying to how do we restore some ecological processes and functions to improve the ecological system. Well, there are some targets out there, and I think
appreciate that explanation, really do. Thank you.
I think one other thing, I think the expectation is that the revision of Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan is going to try to articulate more about a long-term vision about how much habitat we think we might need to have a functioning ecosystem. And so I know you all are deeply embedded, particularly Chair Thompson, in that process.
Commissioner Biaggi, would you like to have Campbell reach out to you and some of the farmers directly and set up that meeting? Would there be any value there?
We are
I'd be open
at
to
your
that.
service. Let us know, and we'd be happy to come
Okay.
with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right, thank you.
So I was going to, I'm sorry.
Diane Burgess.
I think right now there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly on the Delta. And I think that those involved, some people have concerns about their intentions and agendas, and there's been activity where people are kind of positioning themselves to be doing things that ahead of other things. And so I think you're kind of probably hearing a reflection on those kind of things, that we are concerned that there's things happening related to other things. I'm doing good, aren't I?
Well put.
Am I doing good? So I think this is just a reflection of our, there's mistrust, there's concern about people's intentions. So I think coming back, having real specifics and kind of having maybe even a list of who's stepping up and willing to do certain things might give us a little more confidence in those activities.
Absolutely. And that actually is all on our website. You can see the notes from this two-day charrette, everyone who attended. It is available. So, and maybe in hindsight, next time I would have put a packet together with all that in there.
Any other comments?
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Don?
Yeah, I had a chance to attend the evening session after you'd had the charrette, but, and I know that when we had discussion at the commission sometime prior to that, or at the Conservancy, I think I did mention certainly the need to try to do outreach, and I think you certainly attempted to do that. I think Commissioner Biaggi's and others' comments here this evening, they'll reflect that even with best efforts, oftentimes I think that there's, inability to reach some of the folks who, again, might be engaged in other activities, making a living farming, but I would just note that I think, that to what Commissioner Burgess said, though, that there is a great deal of distrust. You're aware of that, Campbell, and certainly members of this body are. And I think it reflects just the fact that when we now see more common reference to Met's Islands, those islands all have names. I've said this in other forums before. I think we've got to continue to refer to. The shorthand is, yes, Metropolitan may have purchased those islands, but they all have names. They have a history. I think that's part of, gets reflected over time. Just assume that Metropolitan owned those islands for a long time. Well, they haven't, and how they want to become a neighbor, because they were there that evening. I heard some of the comments and so forth, and how they can maybe be a better neighbor. Your panel went through, a good deal of conversation. I had a chance to hear that. But I think it reflects an ongoing, discussion that needs to continue to happen both here this evening, but in when the Conservancy's in session and when other bodies are pulled together. And certainly the effort can reflect, hopefully, the input of folks who have been neighbors and long been neighbors and long been residents of those areas, and I think should and hopefully will as this effort goes forward. So I don't criticize you for the outreach that you attempt to do. Obviously, you hear from folks who weren't able to be reached in that outreach effort. I think we need to redouble those efforts as we go forward.
Will do.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Oscar?
So I think, first of all, thank you for coming, and I think, you're hearing a lot of the sort of the common sentiment from this body, and it's going to continue. I think what might be helpful is if you identify I think you have some sense of sort of the next steps and what a timeline might look like relative to what you're proposing. Those key milestones are going to come, and I think it's only when we hear about them after the fact that there's sort of this additional sort of skeptical eye that's placed upon it. So to the extent that we could get a timeline for what it is that you're anticipating over the course of the next year, because certainly if Prop 3 is successful, that means there's money, and that means that there will be funding potentially to actually accomplish some of the things that are going to be outlined. And so I think a timeline that lays out what those key milestones might look like is helpful for a body like this to at least look at and be able to share with others. So in the event that there's sufficient planning opportunities to participate in those initial public workshops that are available, it's otherwise on us. But I think a timeline that we can see what it looks like would be helpful.
Great. Yeah, should have included that in the staff report. We did have an initial public workshop. We had this day and a half charrette. We have 3 meetings with the landowners and experts to try to take the information that we got from the charrette. We'll have another workshop that will sort of share the general outcome of all of that in November. And then we'll take a draft towards the end of November. There will be a draft available for consideration. We'll make sure that the commission gets it. And then ultimately, our board will look at it and say, is this a strategy? And a strategy is a loose term. It's, how do we collectively think we want to approach investing in this corridor in the future? And that's when the proposition funding. But absolutely, we can provide that in our document as well.
Any other comments or questions? Campbell, thank you.
Well,
Oh, you- are
I,
you done?
I know Eric only wanted so much time, and if I could, I'll just zip through our proposition funding and where we are on those
Okay.
very quickly.
Then we have the public if they want to.
Oh, yes, okay. So Proposition 1, the Delta Conservancy has $50 million for ecosystem restoration, water quality improvements, and agricultural sustainability. And we've run 3 annual cycles of that money. We've funded 19 projects for about $24 million. We just completed our concept proposal round for our 4th cycle. We received 14 proposals requesting about $11 million. So we have a very extensive review process that includes Erik Vink is one of our technical reviewers. Department of Food and Agriculture is one of our technical reviewers, as well as all the biologists, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries. And we have a very long process. We notify all the communities. We make sure that our applicants are talking about their interaction with their surrounding landowners and local support and agency support for their projects. We evaluate all that, and then we will take recommendations for funding for those projects to our board in May of next year. So that's Proposition 1. Proposition 68, I'm very excited, passed. That brings $12 million to the Conservancy, and that is our first chunk of money for the other half of our mandate, economic development. So we anticipate using that for Delta as place efforts, public access, recreational opportunities. It's not a huge chunk of money, but we're very excited. We have been working with Erik Vink and his staff to review the community action plans, the economic sustainability plan, any place where we've talked about how should we be investing in the Delta for recreation, public access. Other things we've looked at are the 5-year marketing strategy that was a joint effort between the Commission and ourselves, the Delta sign plan, a joint effort as well. Trying to get our arms around, well, what are the projects that are out there and how do we potentially fund those projects with this pot of money? We'll be developing grant guidelines in the near term for money to help plan those projects, technical assistance, because we know a lot of those projects are pretty new and there's not a lot of capacity. How do we make sure that we get projects moving forward in the Delta, and then of course local assistance grants. So we're pretty excited about that, and hopefully that'll have a meaningful impact in the Delta. That process will, just like our Proposition 1 process for grant guidelines, will be very heavily involved in having local input and review of that document to include coming to the Commission as we have in the past with Prop 1. Eric mentioned Prop 3. That is $100 million that will come to the Conservancy if that passes in November. That funding is for all of our legislative purposes. So again, we anticipate ecosystem restoration, water quality, ag sustainability, Delta as place as well. We are thinking about how we would structure ourselves and to run those funds, and likely we'll have a set of grant guidelines for that process as well that will hopefully be somewhat seamless with Prop 68, so that if we have those 2 funding sources, we're really only running 2 solicitations for 3 funding sources. So that's our expectation.
Okay.
Any questions?
Any questions? Thanks, Campbell.
Thank you.
I don't have any cards. Anyone in the public wish to address this item? Seeing none, we're going to move on. I'm sorry. Okay. So Andrew, where's Andrew? Oh, there, okay.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, if I could just say, because Andrew from the Stewardship Council missed the public comment, and he's also one of those people that has to leave the room when there's any discussion of Cal WaterFix. So my initial thought was, hey, we could do a public comment at the end of the meeting, but he might be out in the hallway shielding his ears when we do it. So if it's okay to hear from him, he wanted to specifically make a very short, I will emphasize the word short, public comment. If that's okay, Mr. Chair.
That'll be fine. I hope it's okay with my colleague. Okay, Andrew, you're on.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson. Commissioners, thank you very much for fitting me in here. I apologize for missing the public comment period. We were actually meeting with one of the county representatives here, which is really what I want to talk to you about today. I just want to as an FYI, keep you all in the loop that the Delta Stewardship Council is just now starting to embark on a Delta Region Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Strategy. Provided you a very short, kind of 2-page summary of our plan. And it will, the first step over the next year or two, this will be a 3-year process, will be a vulnerability assessment where we want to really characterize the impacts of sea level rise, precipitation and runoff pattern changes, air and water temperatures, and the risks that those have to specific Delta assets, the residents, agriculture, community facilities and services, land uses, water management, flood control, parks and recreation, transportation, natural resources, energy infrastructure. And I really wanted to, we've been sitting here listening to some of the concerns about other projects, and we want to highlight that we really want to work with the local interests and specifically the local governments on this project to make sure that we get information out to them that's useful and bring information that they have into our process and that we're interfacing. One of the things specifically that we have done to make sure that we have good integration with the local governments is we've jointly written a scope of work and a request for a Civic Spark fellow with DPC staff. And Matt Kubasik, who's sitting back here, is a fellow who will be with the Delta Stewardship Council for the next 11 months. And his charge, Civic Spark, is really focused on building capacity at the local level, and so he won't be the only resource, but he will be one full-time resource that we can put on direct engagement with the local government. So over the next months, we'll be contacting folks in the county, each of the 5 county governments, hopefully Stockton and City of Sacramento and the other cities, Rio Vista, that we can engage with, and we hope that to have a very robust engagement and back and forth and collaborative activity with them. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them, and we certainly would be happy to come back and brief the commission as we get further along and we have more information to share.
All right, Andrew, thank you.
We'll make sure we're on the agenda next time.
We have a question. Yes.
Yeah, just one comment. I know Caltrans, they've done vulnerability assessments throughout the state.
Yep.
And I would imagine probably some of the stuff that they're working on might be able to be some benefit for your effort. So
yeah, we are working with them, and we've looked at some of the stuff they've done, and we've just been meeting with the San Joaquin Council of Governments, which is also doing a transportation vulnerability assessment, and they're just getting off the ground. So we're definitely interfacing with those activities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, let's move on to item 10. Excuse me, item 9.
Yeah, and this is Stacy Hayden, our information officer, presenting this item.
Thank you, Chair Thompson and Commissioners. I will try to make this brief. I wanted to share some of the activities that we've been working on at the Commission in order to help support Delta flood awareness and safety, particularly for our community members who live in the primary zone, but also extending that to everyone as well. There's a number of things going on. First, I'd like to share with you that starting on October 20th through October 27th is California Flood Preparedness Week, and we're going to recommend today that you consider the approval of Resolution 1801 for making October 15th through the 20th our Delta Flood Preparedness Week. And I do want to share a few things of what we'd like to do during that week this year. This year we're actually going to have 2 events. Normally we just have one. The first event is going to be on October 17th at Big Break Regional Shoreline. We're very excited about this. working with other partners from the state and federal government, as well as partnering with East Bay Regional Shoreline. We'll be having an unveiling. It says 1:30 in your packet. It's going to be at 2:30, actually, that just changed today. On October 17th at Big Break, we'll be unveiling a high water mark as well as a corresponding interpretive sign to talk about flood impacts on the Delta community, as well as that high water mark that people will be able to go out and see themselves where that water gets to or has gotten to in the past and at Big Break. So there's going to be quite a few people there. We're really hoping you can come out and join us for that event. We'd love to have you there. And then, of course, on October 20th is our 5th annual Delta Flood Safety Fair. Last year's event was our best yet. We had more people than we've had at any event yet. We're continuing to grow this event. It is going to be in the same place that it was held last year at the Walnut Grove Library, who's been a big support for this effort. We have lots of great exhibitors that come out, and it's really a great opportunity this year as well. We're trying to deepen our partnership with the school district as well to continue to get more children and families out to this fair. So if you can make it to that as well, we'd really appreciate it. There's a lot of information that we share to the Delta community at the fair, everything from flood insurance to meeting their local responders. So there's a lot of solid information, and there's also a lot of fun. In order to support this, we are also putting out our 5th annual Delta Flood Safety Calendar. It's more beautiful than ever this year. You'll be seeing that soon. I don't have it in hand quite yet. We do partner with Department of Waterways, Department of Water Resources on printing the calendar. It's designed in-house. It's something we're very proud of, and we mail that out, and by we, I mean me. We do mail that out directly to roughly 5,400 households in the primary zone of the Delta. So I just wanted to give you an update to all of that. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And aside from that, I would like you to consider today approving the resolution 1801 for making October 15th through 20th Delta Flood Safety Week this year. Thank you.
Questions, comments for Stacy? You heard the staff request to pass 1801. Is there a motion to do that?
So moved.
Moved by Natoli,
Second.
second by Villegas. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? You got unanimous. Good for you. All right. Item 10. You want to introduce it, Erik?
Yes. Item 10 is the Delta Trail Master Plan. And just a little bit of background for commission members. Legislation in 2006 established the Great California Delta Trail Act, which directs the commission to create a trail linking the San Francisco Bay Trail in eastern Contra Costa County with the Sacramento River Trail all the way up in Sacramento. And of course, the city of West Sacramento has trail segments on its side of the Sacramento River as well. So obviously, there's a lot of delta in between those two regions, and the intention of then Senator Tom Torlakson, who's an avid cyclist, was to create this trail network through the Delta that would link those. The commission received support in the current state budget to be able to pursue a Delta Trail Master Plan. What's in front of you today is a proposed scope of work for the Delta Trail Master Plan. I would be happy to answer any questions. I think the one thing I want to say about this is, because I know amongst some members of our commission there's a lot of concern and perhaps grave concern over a trail network through the interior Delta. The master plan is not intended to draw lines on the map and say the bike lanes are going to go here, or the equestrian trail is going to go here. It's really intended to be a higher level document. We're going to take a very close look at what local governments throughout this region are currently planning and some are more advanced in their planning than others. And the master plan, I describe it as really a 30,000-foot overview of the Delta Trail. From there, we will get into specifics about where, with future efforts, about where trail segments might go. I anticipate us doing this work with local officials. I don't see us doing the planning independent of our local governments in the Delta. And for the region that we're trying to stitch together here, that's primarily the counties, the 5 Delta counties. So that's just a little bit of background about this. I maybe have not even come close to answering the questions you have. Our intention, my intention in putting this on the agenda was to seek your consent for this scope of work. That can either be through a formal motion, or if commissioners feel pretty comfortable with it and there's a general nodding of the heads, we can proceed. There will be a corresponding item, an action item on the November commission agenda requesting the commission grant your executive director the authority to execute a contract. I'm pretty sure by the time we meet in November, we'll probably have a proposed contractor, and so the whole package would come back to you at that time. So that's my report. I probably have maybe done less than an adequate job of kind of explaining this. Ideally, we would have had the whole shooting match up on the agenda this evening and ask for the commission's approval to both to approve the scope of work and then to authorize me to enter into a contract, but I didn't word it correctly when I sent out the agenda for review and when we posted the agenda.
So the new attorney caught you, huh?
No, actually, this was Jessica Tucker Mole, and so
okay.
I will say that she was on vacation for about a week, and so we'll blame it on her vacation. But the intention would be to bring this back in November at our November meeting and seek the commission approval for awarding the contract.
So you would like to hear some sort of discussion about the scope of work?
Yeah, if there are any concerns about this, absolutely. That's the intention of putting it on the agenda.
Yeah, quick question on this. I'm not sure how typically scope of work documents read, but shouldn't a timeline be involved here, an idea of how long it will take to do this project, timelines or benchmarks against which you're measuring the progress of this project?
Yeah, that could certainly be part of a scope of work, and it will definitely be part of the we're actually looking to do this a little differently. Often what is common with public agencies is that they'll put the call out for work that they want to have done, and when you do that, you have to pretty much just blindly announce it. You can't do any conferring with potential contractors. Our intention is to confer with contractors. We've learned about a contracting procedure that we can actually reach out to prospective contractors and talk with them about the work we'd like to have done. And so we're holding off on the timing because we want to talk it through. We have some ideas about how this work should unfold and under what time frame, but ultimately that will certainly be part of the proposed contract that we're asking the commission to approve. So we're not quite there yet, but we plan to get there. And in part, we plan to get there through conversing with some entities that we expect will be interested in doing this work for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Erik kind of correctly, certainly in providing his overview, I know that from past discussions before this commission over a course of probably more than 20 years from time to time, obviously, and coming out of the Delta Reform Act and the Torlakson Bill, was, some charges to this commission to oversee some additional work on trail connectivity and the Great Delta Trail. I would just say I think it's, to your point, Erik, but would want to reemphasize once again that the need to approach this a bit cautiously, certainly with as it relates to not only mapping existing conditions is one thing, and I don't know what goes into the effort there, but we know what, it's pretty elementary to go and pull land use and zoning maps and to see where, public lands are and other transportation circulation maps. Those are pretty readily accessible. So if we're going to have a contractor, again, we had some discussion in Conservancy a couple months ago about, what that paper search is as it relates to some of these projects and what goes into that. But I do think that the community outreach, and again, points made this evening already about, it's almost like drinking from a fire hose for folks in the Delta. Is you just keep getting one study after another study after public engagement, and the public you have is if you want to state it generously, it's 500,000 residents, but when it comes to landowners and farmers and business owners and a lot of stretches of Delta, and I'll speak for Sacramento County specifically, you're going to the same people time and time again. And I think the Commission's been sensitive to that and certainly done some good work as it relates to branding and public outreach, and so as the Conservancy, I certainly would comment to that as well. But I think we're going to need to be very cognizant that, as expressed by commissioners, some of them farmers in the past have served on this commission, as well as obviously ones that are represented here today, a concern about how you integrate trails and whether it's off, off highway and or related to existing roadways when it comes to normal activities. And you can go into the Delta this very moment and see folks moving product and large equipment, and to integrate that with bicyclists or pedestrians, and then when you go into spraying activities during the seasons and planting, I guess I would just preach a lot of caution because, again, having access to the beauty that's the Delta, and certainly for people to enjoy that and the fruits of those harvests, that's all very important to the economic development. But without going long this evening, I think our contractors, when you bring this back before us in November, need to be sensitized, certainly in Sacramento County, but I would trust it's that way in our other 4 Delta counties as well, to be very sensitive to, obviously connecting trails between suburban areas and rural areas, but the agricultural areas, and then, how that gets attended to over time. Because I can tell you that just in the county and even in the urban setting, we have challenges in public places, and I think there's been recent information come forth via federal ruling that now allows folks to maybe take up occupancy on public places, which really interjects a whole nother aspect into trails that you want to have access, certainly for folks that want to have legitimate use of that and to enjoy the things that people in the Delta and others know. And so I guess I would, kind of a long way of saying, I just think, to your point, Erik, we need to be very, very thoughtful when it comes to that. I think you will be, obviously, on behalf of the Commission, but I think that any contractor that's going to take on another effort with folks in the Delta to talk about how we connect the Great Delta Trail needs to be sensitive to those issues as well. So, yeah, thanks.
Diane?
Yeah, I sat in a meeting at least 5 or 6 years ago in Contra Costa County where we were identifying, and as someone that sat on East Bay Regional Park District, I can tell you trails are not built in a few years. Sometimes you'll find those really easy spots, and then you find those spots that you don't even know how you're going to get to. So I think we need to have expectations that it's not going to be a design, build, and go kind of thing. It's going to be a vision, and then it probably will identify the low-hanging fruit, easy stuff, and then there will be those places where you won't know how you're going to make it happen.
Thank you so much for your service.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Anyone from the public wishing to make a comment? Barb?
Hello, I'm Maria Castillo. I go to Stagg High School. I'm a senior. And real estate was really I learned a lot. And
Thank you. I would just like to say that looking back in history, I was at the legislative meetings when the Delta Reform Act was passed. I went to many of the committee meetings. I was there when our senators and assembly people were taken off committees as this legislation was being written. And one of our assembly members, Mrs. Yamada, Assemblymember Yamada, was actually taken off one of the committees because of her choice of language and whatever else was happening during these sessions. So as all of this is being discussed here years later, this was 2009, I would just like to say that all of these concepts that are being discussed are kind of being imposed on the Delta by other parts of the state. So, yes, it was passed, but the discussion that went on was very, very rocky, and this is what we're left with. So I do agree that we do want the people of the Delta to stay informed. Thank you.
Okay, what's the, oh, yes.
Are you going to concentrate on state lands? Because I see two issues. I see one, if you're going to go on private
Right.
levies, that's crazy in my opinion. And then some of those, if you're going to go on little state roads in the islands, they're like 1.5 lanes, and that's as crazy as, but if you took Sherman Island and built a trail around the whole island, they could go around there all day long, and who cares? They go around in a circle. I mean, you know, or Twitchell, or Staten Island, or whatever.
Yeah, we're certainly not that far along. Yeah, I mean, your point's well taken. This is going to be, and I really appreciate what Commissioner Berg has stated. It's, you know, this is not something that's going to happen quickly. There's real significant challenges to creating any kind of a trail network through a rural agricultural area with roads that are very narrow and often on levees, and so there's significant challenges out there. I really don't have an answer for you, but it's going to be very challenging.
Yeah, who's going to maintain these trails? You know,
Yeah, well, it's not intended to be the commission. That's why it's really incumbent upon us to be working with local agencies, with any agencies really, but with the local agencies in particular. The Delta Trail segments that have been designated to date have been in the urban parts of the Delta, and it's largely been through the efforts of either local cities or regional park districts like East Bay Regional Park District. And so that's the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, and then it's going to get a lot more challenging from there.
Okay, what's the pleasure of the commission? Or do we have a pleasure?
And again, this can either be a formal adoption of the scope, or if people are okay, it will come back before we select a contractor, so I do want to stress that point.
I'd like to see the November presentation.
With scope of work and the contractor, you will have had those
Yeah, I
discussions?
believe that by November we will have a proposed contractor to do this work, and we can queue it up where the commission can hear from that entity, or we can describe it for you.
Okay. Does that work?
I mean, it seems like there's sufficient interest around the dais that we probably can request that they come to the meeting. But this would be the right time to express any concerns about the scope of work, because we would like to kind of cement that into place. That'll be critical to being able to pull together the whole package.
Okay, I think I'm hearing general consensus to move it forward, and we'll bring it back in November. Okay?
Great, thank you.
Public comment we had. Okay, we'll move on to item 11 now. Erik?
Yeah, and for this item, I'll introduce Blake Roberts. He's our senior environmental planner. He's also our lead on Delta Heritage, and he'll be introducing this topic.
Thank you very much tonight. I'd like to just give a kind of a brief introduction, and then I'll be handing it over to Michael Garavaglia of Garavaglia Architecture. My name is Blake Roberts. I'm a senior environmental planner for the Commission. It's a pleasure to talk to you. As you probably know, the Commission has been taking steps to make the Delta a National Heritage Area in conformance with the Delta Reform Act. Although National Heritage Areas are within the National Park Service system, they're fundamentally different than a national park. There's no federal ownership or regulation of the land. Rather, what they are is a partnership between the National Park Service and a local entity. In this case, it would be the Commission, to focus on preserving and telling a nationally important story, the nationally important story of the Delta. And these projects may involve historic preservation, natural resource conservation, recreation, heritage tourism, and education. Currently, we're waiting on congressional action on designating the Delta a National Heritage Area. So in the meantime, the Commission has been working on projects that elevate and tell the story of the Delta through the Delta Heritage Area Initiative. So in 2016, the Delta Stewardship Council agreed to fund a commission effort to promote historic preservation and heritage tourism through the preparation of feasibility studies for 3 selected projects. The feasibility studies, which will be described more by Michael Garavaglia, assess the viability of a proposed use of a building and site, provide recommendations for the project, and identify next steps. The feasibility studies are an important first step in the Commission's work to promote these projects and other similar projects throughout the Delta. The Commission is supporting these projects through not just the feasibility studies, but we'll be working with the projects and other projects to look at possible funding sources, organizational help, and then steps like the Delta Sign Plan to sort of guide people throughout the Delta. The Council and Commission have already started work on another project which would involve interpretive planning, oral histories, and museum displays for one of the selected projects, the 1883 Clarksburg Schoolhouse. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael Garavaglia of Garavaglia Architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake. Appreciate it. Well, this has been an exciting project for us. It's been a little time in getting it organized, but we've been very honored to be working with this and in the Delta itself. The Delta Heritage Delta Heritage Area Initiative feasibility studies are sort of an outflow of a mission. I always like to think about what is the mission that our projects might be working under, and under this, your commission and the Delta Stewardship Council have worked in conjunction to help support this. The mission is advancing projects that protect and enhance the unique cultural, recreational, and agricultural values of the California Delta as an evolving place. Under that, some of the goals are to preserve, rehabilitate, and adaptively reuse the Delta's agricultural, historical, natural, and recreational heritage resources, elevate awareness of the Delta heritage, and promote visitation to those resources. Some of the themes that we were working with that have come through the work with the heritage areas: agricultural heritage, Asian and Pacific Islander heritage, gearhead heritage, I like that one, prohibition heritage, we all like that one, and transportation heritage. So those are some of the major sort of themes or contexts in which we're working under, and individual projects that might come forward or might have been looked at here involve buildings, landscapes, orchards, parks, gardens, cemeteries, roads, trails, walkways, and public art. These are all some of the resources. We're working with primarily, obviously, historic or cultural resources under these feasibility studies. So that was the goal of one of the goals of the reports. So some of the issues that come forward in a feasibility study, especially on dealing with historic resources or cultural resources, there's a very interesting nexus. There's feasibility. When working with historic resources, there's certain special considerations, certain ways of dealing with historic resources to protect them. Looking at economic development, you need to understand market demands and financial realities. Am I moving this forward? I'm not. Is it the square button? Or no? Maybe it's the arrow. Okay, sorry about that. Walking and chewing gum at the same time. Okay, organizational capacity is a very important aspect of these projects. As they're pilot projects, they're starting from the grassroots kind of undertakings. So the assessing organizational capacity is important, and we're looking also at cultural diversity. To do this, we assembled a unique team of experts. We are preservation architects with over three decades of experience in working with historic and cultural resources. We brought in a very interesting economics firm, Strategic Economics, who are used to working with very creative and unique projects. We brought in Laura Cole-Rowe, who has a consulting business. She does organizational development and works a lot in the California Main Street program. And Denise Bradley, who's a cultural, a landscape historian and works a lot with cultural landscapes. And one of the bottom line issues about practicality is cost estimation, construction cost estimating, so we had Lee Saylor Associates with that. So we had a three-phase approach to the project, a startup phase, screening phase, and then actually implementing the feasibility studies. So there was a lot of data gathering. We had a kickoff meeting with staff. We did an area-wide visit, which was very interesting. Blake drove the van. And then we started looking at the initial projects, which were, there was 14 or 15 original projects. There were museums, different types of museums. There were some, there was a levee cross-section exhibit, boardwalk in Cortland. There was, we also contemplated a California State Water Museum, which is a very interesting idea, and the Delta, of course, is the place for it to be located, as we all know that. So finally we get, so we looked at those, all the different types of projects, went through the screening phase where we established criteria to do the screening, and which included generally land use, conformance to land use controls, that the project was achievable architecturally or functionally, would be accessible for the disabled. There was cultural and economic development benefits to the surrounding communities, accessing public-private partnerships. The organizations had operations and maintenance programs, and were understanding financial self-sustainability. We were looking at projects that could be accomplished in a shorter period of time, so we were sort of looking at a 3-year window in which projects could move forward, and that we also generally would not require any significant or no hazardous material abatement. Just to get the concept is sort of shovel-ready, not fully, but the idea that projects can move forward fairly quickly. So with that, we went down to the 3 projects. We did site visits with each of the 3 projects, interviewed the organization, looked at their project and business plans, marketing, organizational structure, their economics. We looked at the economic analysis, the building histories. We did condition assessments and those construction cost estimates. Construction cost estimates are a little scary nowadays because construction costs are so inflated, so the numbers you're seeing have a lot of contingency involved, and that's conservative and wise, I think. So the numbers are on the high side, but we are dealing with this as one of the most expensive construction markets that we've ever experienced. And then we came up with recommendations and conclusions for them. So the 3 projects that we arrived at were the 1883 Clarksburg Schoolhouse, obviously in Clarksburg, an artisan residence project in Walnut Grove, and the Asian American Heritage Park in Ileton. So the Clarksburg Schoolhouse, originally built in 1883, functioned as a schoolhouse till about 1923, and it was purchased by a lumber company and used it for part of their operation there. The condition of the buildings is poor to fair. I'll have to mention something here, that when we're looking at these buildings, I look at these kind of buildings all the time, and they don't scare me, but they are kind of beat up, and a lot of it's paint, and the buildings are robust, the materials are solid, so the idea that we're working with these worn down buildings should not scare anybody. The basic structures are solid, and they're easily dealt with. This particular building is being looked at relocating to another site closer to the downtown of Clarksburg, and converted into essentially a interpretive center, museum, community center, events venue, sort of a variety of different uses that could be used. The cost of the project was about, that we estimated was about $1.6 million. And the schedules are sort of similar on these. There's a design phase, a fundraising phase. The design helps to envision what the project could be so that the fundraising can move forward. Then once the funding starts coming in, move forward with permit documents and building permit review, and actually then get the project built. So funding sources generally are going to be government grants, philanthropic giving, foundation grant writing, and community support. The group has already done a fair amount of work in the community and already have a lot of momentum. That's one of the reasons why they were chosen. So the project has good feasibility. All of the groups need to start to dig in on their organizational planning, their financial planning, promotion, their business plan, their sources and use documents, how they're going to pay for this, where the money's coming from. So that's something all nonprofits or all small projects need to consider. I'm going to kind of move through these a little more quickly because I don't want to get too bogged down. Second project was the Artist in Residence project. Oops, sorry, one minute there. And this is it's in Walnut Grove. It's the original Walnut Grove Japanese Methodist Church, built in 1934, and it's contributing to the historic district and the commercial district. A private owner is undertaking this project, and the idea would be to do an artist in residence program within the building. Again, the condition is fair to good, and the interior plaster, which is fairly intact, is a little beat up, but again, it's all, there aren't a lot of planned changes to the interior of the building. It's just being rehabilitated. And cost on this one was approximately 1.6. Again, the schedule is sort of similar. Start with your vision, document, design, and move into a fundraising program phase, which probably is those fundraising phases might be 12, 18, 36 months. It kind of depends on the individuals. As a private development, this owner has access to potentially commercial loans. If he stays with that approach, he might be able to access historic preservation tax credits if his financial situation works well. And we recommended that a 501c3 be established to help the Artist in Residence program, and those two could work together. It could also be converted to a 501c3 project and work under that sort of a venue. Let's move on to the next, the Asian American Park. I'm going to skip two. There we go. And this is sponsored by the Delta Educational Cultural Society. And the idea is to take a vacant lot in the center of Ileton and create a park that increases awareness and educate the public about early Japanese and Chinese communities in the region. And there's a lot of cultural stories to be told. A lot of interest here. The Delta Educational Cultural Society is already a 501c3 organization. There's no, it's an empty lot, so it's a new park, which is a sort of a contemplative space. There's a small gathering space. There's a sort of a pagoda structure which has a particular name which I can't pronounce. And I think that somebody might be able to mention it tonight. So again, it's a fairly simple project as far as that. No existing structure to work with. Estimated price was about $340,000. Again, similar schedule, and already receiving some grants for the project. I think Yolo County provided some funding for this already, and again, to help facilitate the project. The other thing about so all of these projects have the capability of assisting each of the communities in their promotion. It brings awareness, it brings visitors to the area. They're all intended to do that. They create synergy within the community to help build on some of the characteristics that already exist within the community. So these, as seed projects, as pilot projects, I think they're well crafted and really appropriate for the undertaking. So sort of finally, next steps. As I mentioned, all projects like this can benefit from further occupational capacity development, the business of running the organization, the business of doing a project. The more sophisticated one gets, the more people listen. And I think it's easier to raise money when you have a really tight organization, and it's when more, especially with going after grants, they're going to be looking at it. If you go after bank loans, you have to look at the information. The review of the information has to know that you know what you're doing and can respond as necessary. So that, fundraising plans are very important here. Again, the business and organizational plans, the financial documents that one needs to understand how a development project is done. And then identifying marketing and promotional opportunities within the community. This is a partnering undertaking that the individuals can reach out and again, create that synergy within the community. I'll note maybe something that, and Blake, I think, kind of touched on it, is this idea of nonprofit training. That's something that your organization might be able to help with. The funding research and funding for programs is a pretty complex issue, and it's help in that arena is always beneficial, and it's a constantly changing environment. Funding sources are changing all the time. So one of the, kind of in closing, one of the concepts that are out there regarding historic resources and economic development is the National Main Street Program, and California participates in that. Laura Cole Rowe, who's one of our consultants, does a lot of help with that organization. And they work with a sort of a 4-point program: design issues, organizational issues, promotion of usually commercial districts, historic commercial districts, and economic development. The acronym is DOPE. It's again, raising the boat with all these different components is where success is created. And there's a lot of moving parts to that, and I think that as a model of how to think about doing these kinds of these pilot projects and working within these communities has something to offer. So it's something to consider. So, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Any questions? Seeing none. Don?
So will there be any follow-on to this then? You talk about the ways that these projects could move forward, and it's great that you identify those, but then what happens? I guess what happens next? That's my question. For 2 of the projects, that's a significant sum of money. I would just say that both in Isleton and Walnut Grove, pre the loss of redevelopment, both of these areas were in areas that would have qualified for redevelopment funding potentially in Isleton and Walnut Grove, but or maybe some block grant monies. But so what happens next, Erik? I guess we receive this, and who's going to do the follow-through? Is it Blake working with folks?
Yeah, in fact, if I could invite Blake, but while he's coming up to the lectern, and the reason we wanted to present this to the commission this evening is just it's indicative of the work we're doing on Delta Heritage projects. But I did, want to ask Blake specifically to address what next from the commission perspective.
So I think from our perspective, there are a few things that we can help with. One is, I think, as Mike alluded to, organizational issues are definitely something that will need to be worked on. And I think we're trying to assist the project proponents with whatever, if they need to set up a 501c3, we may be able to assist them with that. Funding, I think one of the things that we're trying to seek right now is, Prop 12 or Prop 68 might be potential funding sources for them. So I think guiding them to potential funding sources that are out there would be some of the next steps we can do. And I think, we're really looking forward to continuing to work with the projects, and because part of the reason why we were looking at a 3-year time frame on this is that we wanted to get these projects done, and we wanted to have solid, we wanted to have a project like in Walnut Grove. We wanted to have an artist in residence project where artists start to come to the community. It's already working with the existing artist community within Walnut Grove, and we wanted this to be a solid benefit for the community. So we definitely want to work with the project proponents to kind of continue forward with those.
I was just saying, Walnut Grove, I know he has a lot of experience in restoring buildings, so I've seen his work in the past, and obviously it takes money to fund that, but does a wonderful job, so, thanks.
Thanks, Don. Anyone else? I have one card from the public, Eugene Phillips.
So, hello, I'm Eugene Phillips. I restored the historic Japanese bathhouse in Walnut Grove, and the project of the church is my building. I just want to give you a little bit of background. My father was one of the founding deans of architecture at Cal Poly. He was very much interested in modern design and a great deal about structure. So being a young rebel, of course, I left San Luis Obispo and went to San Francisco to go to the Art Institute. When I was there, basically, because I had all these construction skills, I did a lot of Victorian restoration in San Francisco, and I really enjoyed taking the front facade off a Victorian building, restructuring it, and then putting it all back so it looks like it was never changed. But with that, say, structural background, then, for example, the bathhouse is one of the strongest buildings in that community. It's massive, designed for massive shear strength. It's really strong, but all the original surfaces were taken off, meticulously cleaned, and then reinstalled. So essentially, you can't really tell what was new or old. So while I was doing that, I needed a facility where I could set up a shop. So the church came up for sale, and I couldn't resist. I had to buy it. So basically, I set up my shop space there, and I've done a certain amount of maintenance on the building, but overall it's going to take quite a bit of work. So the goal with that is to come in and create an artist in residence program to utilize the old classrooms as studio spaces, the residential area upstairs as living environments, and then the downstairs would be performance space or gallery space. So essentially people could come into the community, stay at the church for, maybe as much as, say, 6 months or longer to work on their projects and have the support of an arts community there, and then be able to take their product, their art, and go out and, say, take it to other places to show it, or et cetera. And that way you have a variety of creative people coming into the community. They're in a nurturing environment, they have support, and they can work on their art. So this is my goal for this project. It will be a classic restoration. It will be an incredibly strong building when I'm done. And so thank you for your consideration and support.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could just append on, Mr. Phillips does amazing work. He's been a real asset to the historic Walnut Grove community. But I also want to call him out. He created an amazing sculpture to really draw attention to the proposed Delta Tunnel project, and it's been on display in many areas throughout the Delta. So I wanted to tip my hat to him for that as well.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm out of here. So Oscar, you're taking over. Okay. Yeah. Track careful.
All right, that takes us to item 12, the California WaterFix update.
Yeah, and commission members, we're getting close here. I will remind commission members again, there's some refreshments in the room, and the audience members, there's refreshments out in the foyer. This is just an update. It's a quick update, Chair Villegas, about where we are with Cal WaterFix. Just this week, the Commission filed comments on the supplemental EIR, EIS. There's copies. It's in the pile of papers that were at your places there. There's a copy for each of you. The supplemental is not a dramatically changed project. I would summarize it by saying that there's fewer wetland impacts on the proposed changes they've made and slightly more agricultural impacts. But it's really, the supplemental really, it was just kind of tinkering around the edges of what we know California WaterFix to be. And the Commission's substantive comments were earlier transmitted in 2015 and back in 2014 or 13 before then. And we reiterated some of those comments in this letter that we just sent to DWR this week. And that will be the basis of what we'll be compiling for the Delta Stewardship Council process as well. But wanted to present the letter to you, and from there segue into what is really the big action for the Commission, and that will be our involvement with the appeal process before the Delta Stewardship Council on Department of Water Resources certification of consistency with the Delta Plan. And just to be really brief and to paraphrase here, any project in the Delta has to be deemed consistent with the Delta Plan. If anyone disputes that a project is consistent with the Delta Plan, they can appeal. This is the first appeal that the Delta Stewardship Council will have heard under the Delta Plan adopted in 2013. And it's probably the most important appeal that they'll ever hear. This is probably the most important project that will ever come before the Delta Stewardship Council. So there were a number of appellants from throughout the Delta region who appealed, including Barbara Daly here in the audience. The appellants will be able to make their case before the Delta Stewardship Council. That's going to occur at a meeting on October 24th. The first day of the meeting will probably be largely consumed by the Department of Water Resources introducing their project, the Delta Protection Commission, because of our unique role in the statute to advise the Delta Stewardship Council on how to best protect and enhance the unique Delta values. We have a special place on that meeting agenda and up to 30 minutes to present to the Council our take on how Cal WaterFix either does or doesn't protect and enhance the unique Delta values. And I think we've been pretty consistent in our earlier comments that we do not believe it does protect and enhance the unique Delta values. And we'll be relaying that point as well. And then the appellants will have an opportunity to present, and I might have gotten the order a little wrong on that. It could be that the appellants come first and then the Delta Protection Commission follows. No, we're first and then the appellants. So that will probably be at least the first day of a multi-day hearing. And then the Stewardship Council is planning to meet again, if necessary, on October 25th, and again, if necessary, on October 26th. So we're almost a month away from the real big action before the Stewardship Council. This is a real unique opportunity for the Commission to present what we've stated very extensively in our earlier comments on both Bay Delta Conservation Plan and Cal WaterFix, specific comments related to the proposed Delta tunnels. We're formulating our approach now. Obviously, our chair is up on the dais hearing this. Just today, the Stewardship Council announced that 3 of their 7 members are going to be recused from this decision because of potential conflicts. So there are only 4 of 7 Delta Stewardship Council members, including Chair Fiorini and Council members Damrell, Thompson, and who is the 4th? I'm sorry, what was that, Natasha? No, he's no longer a member of the council. Gatto, Council Member Gatto, who's former Southern California legislature. So this gets more interesting by the day. Now we've got 4 of 7 council members that will be voting on whether this proposed project is consistent with the Delta Plan. So the hearing on the appeal convenes on October 24th. The council is not anticipated to take their action on that date. They actually have up to 60 days to make their final determination. And it's anticipated that that will occur at the council, at a council meeting in December. Whether it's their regularly scheduled meeting, which I believe is slated for December 20th, or whether it's a meeting that they establish in advance of that. I don't think they'll do it later than December 20th, but they could do it as late as December 25th. But they do have to act within 60 days of holding the public hearing on the appeal. So that's a little bit about what is ahead of us. One idea I'm formulating is seeing if I can enlist Commissioner Natoli, not necessarily to present the entirety of our presentation, but he was there when the council debated important Delta Plan policies, including one that's really very critical to this whole consistency determination for Cal WaterFix, and that has to do with how the council respects local land use policies when they determine whether a project is consistent with the Delta Plan. And forgive me, Commissioner Natoli, for hitting you with this the first time, but I know you were very integral to those comments, and I know there was a lot of negotiation over what the final language was that ended up in the Delta Plan. And, you know, this is a project that is not consistent with local land use plans in the Delta. And the wording in the Delta Plan is not as ironclad as we would like it. I'm sure that was a great debate before the council when it was adopted, but you know, Commissioner Natoli is an example of someone who can speak really to a fine point about that particular part and probably about other parts of this as well. We're going to be meeting internally at the staff level next week to talk about how we see this opportunity to present our case unfolding before the council, but I would like to just put the notice out there most specifically to Commissioner Natoli, but for that matter to other commissioners as well, that we might want to call on you to help make this case before the Stewardship Council. Anyway, I'll stop with that. I'm sure there are questions and comments you have. But
yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt your
No,
conclusion.
please.
I just was going to say that I would be, you know, more than pleased to, certainly with colleagues on this body, to represent the commission. I know that I've also been called into action since Sacramento County also is an appellant, and to make comments introductory to the appeal that Sacramento County will specifically make that's not inconsistent, obviously, with a number of things I'm sure that the commission will be saying. So we'll need to work out the detail of that. But again, I certainly intended, in fact, it was interesting just today, had noted on the information came through the last couple of days and told my staff on my calendar to make sure that those days are open. So, but I would certainly, Vice Chair Villegas and other members of this commission, I think that, you know, assuming people's time allows it, you said it well. I think this is probably as big as anything that the Delta Stewardship Council will ever hear. It's big to certainly the communities represent, to the various interests that are state reflected here on this commission, and I think that it probably warrants, not only our participation, but our attention and I think coordination, and certainly working through the vice chair with you, Eric. I'll be happy to participate. And again, I need to just coordinate that. I plan to be there though for this, and hopefully share some perspective that Mr. Fiorini and I will probably are the two members that will recall, because we both of us served on the commission that and when we adopted the plan in 2013, and I represented this commission as its chair at the time, and we introduced a lot of comments, and certainly I think we're able to achieve some level of success in making sure that concerns that related to both the legislation, but I think to the interests that are reflected on this commission, certainly the local interests, but interests in total were reflected ultimately in that plan. And I think that, as your letter said, and as you just said a moment ago, to try to somehow disassociate the co-equal goals from the very important and the very connected qualifiers as it relates to protecting and enhancing the values of the Delta is just disingenuous. I mean, it's currently written to the plan, it was in the legislation, and I think your letter reflects it well, but I think that's something, again, we as a commission, and I don't know that maybe you have a working committee of this body, because I think all of the interests, and certainly I know the state folks certainly are, have to, approach us, from a certain perspective as related to their departments and direction from the administration, but certainly others on this commission, city council members, board of supervisor members, and reclamation district interests are certainly, I think, can come together, respecting obviously the state's interest on this commission. So I would just encourage us to participate, because I think it is as big as anything that this commission is going to, that council is going to take up, but this commission has a very integral role legislatively, but I think certainly as a part of what we reflect on behalf of the Delta. So.
Well said. Any other comments on this? Does that conclude your update, or were you kind of going back?
No, that does, and actually just, and again, this has been very much a work in progress over the last few days, and I haven't even had a chance to speak with Vice Chair Villegas about this, but I mean, my intention would be for you to be the primary contact on this in terms of how we decide to move forward. And a question to our council here, and I'm always confused about this, and maybe I should not be, but 2 commission members is okay for a conversation, but 3 commission members must be a public meeting. So to the extent that we want to talk about this without inviting the world to it, it would need to be a conversation limited to 2 commission members. Mr. Vice Chair, I don't know what your preference is. I always turn to the chair in this instance to determine how to make an appointment or an ad hoc or whatever, but just so that the commission is clear, 2 would be okay. We can talk privately. 3, we're going to have to telegraph it to whoever is interested. So.
Understood. Yeah, and so in addition to Sacramento being party to the appellate at the appeals, YOLO, I know Contra Costa, there are others, well, at least 8 others, I think. So.
I mean, I think my own recommendation would be if I could confer with the Vice Chair and with Commissioner Natoli on this. If others really want to be involved with this, I'll leave that to your discretion, Mr. Vice Chair.
Okay.
Oscar, if it would help, again, I certainly, without getting into any serial meeting, could talk with the executive director, but if you think it'd be helpful, Oscar, to have you and another commission member, again, to work on, again, as far as being able to show up and, speak, to the matter, certainly information that's common to what we all have before us can be brought out, and I can probably do that through Eric, and then maybe I'll use the chair with another member of the commission to coordinate on that front. And again, if it gets into the situation where 3 or 4 of us need to come together, we can set a meeting, I guess. We're not going to be that big secret about what we're going to say. I think it's clearly in the legislation, and we're going to say.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't think it's a top secret strategy session, and truthfully, we probably wouldn't have many people attending. And you're right, there is no secret. One thing I did want to mention, and I should have highlighted this in the letter, but I want to draw your attention to the second paragraph, and this is really a message that's directed toward our state agency representatives on the commission. We will always preface anything we say with acknowledging that we have state agency representatives on our commission who probably, or not probably, don't subscribe to what we're presenting, and that certainly will be a statement that we'll telegraph loud and clear before the Stewardship Council.
Okay. Okay, so we obviously don't want to get into serial meetings. We don't want to be accused of that. But nothing precludes us from continuing to dialogue directly with you, absent any discussion amongst ourselves. So we can communicate with Erik, right?
So the limitation would be that you can't collectively share your views with Erik about the matter. If you do that collectively, but you're doing it individually over time, then that creates a problem.
Say that again, I'm sorry?
So Erik essentially can't be the center of a wheel, right? So if you guys are all conveying your opinions to him, then that becomes problematic. So I think unless you want to publicly notice and agendize meetings for a working group around this, I would encourage you to limit it to 2 members.
Got it.
If you want to use 2 members to sort of be Erik's sounding board on this, and then separately use Supervisor Natoli as the spokesperson to some extent, that might be okay, as long as the supervisor is not sharing his views and being part of that dialogue that's happening with Erik and the other members.
Understood. Okay. All right. So do we need to take that action? Should we?
Well, maybe the only thing we need to do tonight, if there is and the more I think about this, a publicly noticed meeting on this would be fine. We're not divulging any grave secrets here. If there's the desire to do that, my recommendation would be to be in touch with whoever wants to participate in that tomorrow, and that we set that for as soon as possible, which is at least 10 days into the future. So we'd be looking at a date the week of the first week of October for having that meeting. October 15th is the deadline the Stewardship Council has set for receiving input. It's not a requirement, but they strongly request that anyone presenting at that hearing on October 24th present their materials to the council on October 15th. So without making this too complicated, if you want to gather the names of those who would like to participate in this, we can work with you all to call a meeting, and then obviously once the meeting's set, anyone can attend. It's not just whoever had raised their hand to participate.
Yeah, so you're saying that any testimony that's going to be entered in the record has to be in writing, or just if there was going to be written material available, that needs to be?
What they I'll just quote because it's short. It says, and this is a 8-page document the council released last week, their notice of public hearing, and so I probably should have had copies for everyone because it might be of interest all the way around. The council strongly prefers that parties and other interested persons submit written statements ahead of the hearing. The council requests that any party or interested person who intends to present an oral statement at the hearing also submit a written statement in order to assist the council's consideration of such statements.
So it could be a summary.
And then they go on to say they request them by October 15th.
Well, they strongly encourage it. I mean.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's fine.
It becomes part of the materials they distribute. There would be a real value in trying to meet that deadline, I believe. If you can't, then they're not going to turn away comment on October 24th. So,
Mr. Chair, if I could just say, though, that as a part of a package, again, even if folks weren't able to be at the hearing, but for example, you have commissioners here who represent agriculture, those who come from a background of certainly understanding recreation, and I think this commission has over time done economic development or economic studies to talk about the impacts. I think summary documents and or comments that could be shared by commissioners, I think it would be very powerful. Again, kind of speaking to the day, it's one thing to hear a little history from me and on certainly my passion on this issue, but it's better, I think, to have an amalgamation of this commission and the viewpoints that collectively represent from cities, counties, reclamation districts, farmers, recreation, environmental perspectives, and whatever else gets fed into that. And again, 30 minutes is not a long time when you start adding all that up. But I do think that, again, certainly you're very clear and articulate in your speak. But I think that as commission members, if we couldn't be there as a part of the package, though, as a commission, certainly representing the Delta Protection Commission and the people that we represent in the interests, would be very, very helpful. And so that might be the way to address some of those issues about how we coordinate a presentation. I just offer that as a thought. So.
Yeah, I think the only point I want to make is that, I mean, this is a real unique opportunity for us to get a lot of information into the record, and it's a pretty target-rich environment when it comes to how this project will affect the unique Delta values. And so I just would want to make sure that we maximize that opportunity, and certainly in previous comment letters that the commission staff has prepared for consideration by the full commission, we've strived to do our best to really turn over every rock in that document. But as you know, it was a gargantuan document, and we've certainly learned things since then that I wished we had put into our letter that we didn't get in. Fortunately, other people got it into the record. So there's a lot to say here, and without even going into any ideology, just solely focused on how this project is going to affect Delta agriculture, recreation, culture, and natural resources. And so we just, and getting it out there before, my goal is to present something to the council that is just impossible for them to refute. And the statute says they need to take that into account, and if it's feasible, they need to do it. So
I would just think testimony from Commissioners Biaggi and Ferguson and Van Lobensel's, who are actively engaged in farming or involved obviously with reclamation districts, have generations of not only investment in their blood, sweat, and tears, but also I think come from a perspective that's very important for. It sounds like now 4 commissioners are going to decide, potentially the consistency of what's being proposed, so I think George and Bob and Justin all, again, if you can't be there, but I think certainly to have something in writing, that says, here we are, we've been here for 6, 7 generations, and we're here to stay, but this is going to have a tremendous impact on our way of life, and certainly the ability to farm and to continue to do what you do best, and that is, put food and fiber on tables people throughout this state and nation. So just again, I would encourage that, and again, I think other interests as well. And if there's a state agency that can, buck the administration, it'd be great to have them as there as well. But I do think that we as locals have the ability to weigh in very heavily.
All right. Any other thoughts or comments on that? So you will then we'll coordinate setting up our meeting.
Yeah, well, is there a show of hands of who would like to be participating in that?
So it might be helpful to just have clarity that you have 2 members that are sort of designated as a committee to work with Erik, but then that if you decide to hold a public meeting that includes other members, you could do that. But it just might help for clarity of executive action to have 2 members sort of designated.
Okay.
And you might want to have everybody kind of vote.
Okay. So,
do you want me to motion?
Sure, if you would.
So I'll make the motion that Commissioner Foley and Vice Chair Villegas are the committee to assist for the Delta Stewardship Council 24 through 26 meetings. Is that good?
So that works? All right. So we have a second on that?
Yeah. Second.
All right. So we do have a second.
And I'm sorry, who seconded, Mr. Chair? Commissioner Loftus, thank you.
Commissioner Loftus. All right, so we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please.
Actually, for this vote, Mr. Chair, I think we probably will have state agencies in a different position from you, maybe not, but can we ask for a roll call vote? Or?
Sure. Oh, very good. Okay, so we'll do a roll call vote. We have a motion and a second. Yep.
And Commission Clerk Medina, because your back is to her, Commissioner Lester Moffitt left the meeting earlier, so.
I got it. Thank you. Vice Chair Villegas.
Aye.
Commissioner Natoli.
Aye.
Commissioner Burgess.
Aye.
Commissioner Cott. Commissioner Loftus.
Yes.
Commissioner Biaggi.
Yes.
Commissioner Ferguson.
Yes.
And I have Commissioner Slater.
Yes.
Commissioner Flournoy.
Abstain.
And Commissioner Roberts.
Abstain.
Okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. That's 8. So.
All right, so the motion carries.
So,
with
yeah,
8.
so the vote was 8 affirmative, 0 noes, 2 abstentions, and we note those as abstentions.
All right. Okay, so that motion carries, so more work to come. Thank you very much for that. That takes care of that item, unless there are any other comments. So that takes us to item 13 is commissioner comment.
Public comment.
Oh, public comment? Yes, come on up, Barbara. I didn't see your hand up there.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Daly, and now I'm representing a group called North Delta Cares. It's one of 3 major groups out in the Delta that have been working on this subject. The other, North Delta Cares, is one. It's in the north part of the Delta, Restore the Deltas near Stockton, and Save the Deltas Discovery Bay. And North Delta Cares was present in 2013 when the Delta Plan was voted in. And we did write a 15-page comment letter, appeal letter, and we would like to request that we cooperate with you when you have this meeting, and that we talk about how we work together on the appeal in the hearing, if that's all right with you.
All right. Any objections to that? So we'll make sure that you're aware or noticed of the public notification that would be required. So
Thank you.
we'll make sure you get that. Thanks. Thank you, Barbara. All right. Any other comments on this item from the public? So if not, that will take care of item 12. That's then item 13 is up next. Commission comments or announcements. Are there any comments? Announcements by any of the commissioners? Seeing none, that one is taken care of. So we are done with our official business, right, Eric?
And the next commission meeting is November 15th in West Sacramento.
Very good. So other than that, we're looking for a motion to adjourn. We have a motion and a second. So all those in favor? Yeah, all those in favor say aye. We're adjourned. Thank you very much.